Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Zoom webinar. My name is Professor Ann Karagosian, and it is my privilege as the director of UCLA's Promise Armenian Institute to welcome you to a lecture entitled Past-Proofing the Future, Theorizing the Erasure of Djulfa 20 Years On, to be delivered by Dr. Simon Maghakyan, a well-known political scientist specializing in the intersection of heritage and security. This lecture is part of our Institute's continuing programming periodically offered pertaining to Armenian cultural heritage, following the highly impactful all-day conference that we hosted on this subject earlier in the year in February of 2025. The recording for which is available on our Promise Armenian Institute website. Dr. Maghakyan was a participant in that conference, and we are delighted to welcome him once again to our PAI virtual stage. Dr. Maghakyan's lecture will discuss a new theoretical framework for explaining the negation of disquieting material heritage in ethnoterritorial conflicts, with a focus on the destruction of Armenian khachkars, or cross stones, in the cemetery of Djulfa, in the historic Armenian region of Nakhichevan by the Azeri military more than 20 years ago. Dr. Maghakyan will explore the multi-layered factors behind such events and will discuss potential pathways for preempting similar outcomes in Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh. We are grateful to Dr. Maghakyan for his impactful research on this difficult subject and for speaking to us this evening on his latest research. I am also pleased to be joined in our program today by UCLA's eminent scholar, Professor Peter Cowe, the Narakatsi Professor of Armenian Studies at UCLA, who will be providing commentary on Dr. Maghakyan's presentation after his talk. I am also pleased to note that our event today is co-sponsored by the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies, the UCLA Narakatsi Chair in Armenian Studies, the Richard Hovhannissian Endowed Chair of Modern Armenian History at UCLA, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, or NASR, and the Ararat Eskidjan Museum. We are grateful for the support of all of our co-sponsors. And on behalf of the UCLA co-sponsors of our event, I would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the indigenous Gabrielino Tongva peoples. It is a privilege for our institution to acknowledge the history of the land on which we are established. Before we move on with our program and the introduction of our two speakers, let me just mention a couple of procedural items. First, let me note that this event is being recorded, and we are hoping at some point in the future that it will be available on our UCLA Promise Armenian Institute YouTube channel. Second, for those in our Zoom audience, please feel free to pose questions using the Q&A link in your Zoom window, especially when the lecture by Dr. Maghakyan and the commentary by Professor Cowe are concluded. We will get to as many of these questions as possible. Please try to be as clear and succinct as possible, of course, in your questions. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce both our speaker and our commentator. Our speaker, Dr. Simon Maghakyan, is a political scientist specializing in the intersection of heritage and security. He is an associate member of the University of Oxford's Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies and is an incoming visiting professor of political science at Colorado College. He has previously held appointments at the University of Denver, Fresno State University, and Tufts University. He earned his Ph.D. in Defense and Security Studies in 2024 from Cranfield University, which is an academic arm of the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense, after he had spent a decade in nonprofit and teaching roles, including at his alma mater, the University of Colorado at Denver. His collaborative predoctoral research used visual forensics to expose Azerbaijan's erasure of Nakhichevan's Armenian heritage, and his forthcoming academic publications include a volume entitled Sovereign Heritage Crime, Security, Autocracy, and the Material Past, to be distributed by Cambridge University Press. This volume advances a new theoretical framework for understanding cultural genocide. After Dr. Maghakyan's presentation, we will hear a brief commentary or discussion on his talk delivered by Dr. Peter Cowe, a distinguished professor in the UCLA Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, and, as I mentioned earlier, the Nadakatsi Professor of Armenian Studies at UCLA. Professor Cowe's wide-ranging research interests include medieval Armenian history, modern Armenian nationalism, and Armenian film and theater. He is the author of 5 books and the editor of 4 additional books. And now I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Simon Maghakyan to our virtual stage. Simon, I will now turn this event over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karagosian, for the generous introduction and welcome, for organizing this event. Thank you to you, your team, your partners, Nasser, Professor Aslanyan, and others. And a special thank you to Professor Cowe for serving as discussant. I'll go ahead and share my PowerPoint so that we can get started. In 2013, I traveled to Iran's northwest border, expecting a magical view. Instead, looking across the Artsakh River into Azerbaijan's exclave of Nakhichevan, I saw desolate grasslands, no stones or signs of what had once been a world unto itself. Decades earlier, my father, pictured here with me, had made his own pilgrimage to the same borderland, then the USSR's southwestern edge. In my preteens, he told me how Soviet patrolmen reluctantly let him pass into a restricted zone so he could wander among thousands of sacred crossstones, khachkars, their carvings depicting medieval life, biblical iconography, and even a double-bodied sphinx. Beneath the stones my father touched rest the merchants whose lasting legacies, as historians Sebu Aslanyan and Ina Bardian's McCabe have documented, shaped early modern global trade, including by establishing Europe's first cafes, the birthplaces of modernity. This was Djulfa, or Hinjula, the world's largest historical Armenian cemetery. While a select few before him, like these Tsarist-era father and son researchers, left photographs, my father did not. Nearing the international border with a camera was risky, and Soviet Armenians like him could not safely traverse Nakhichevan without an Azerbaijani escort. His friend drove him in a car with local Azerbaijani plates. Years later, after my father's passing, I learned how special his visit had been. Even the famed Soviet storyteller Sergei Parajanov, who scouted Djulfa for the color of pomegranates, could not obtain permission to film on the sacred terrain. And the legendary undercover researcher Argam Ayvazyan confided in me that he was unable to publicize photographs of every single stone in the world's largest medieval Armenian cemetery. During his final visit, he had hidden under rocks a roll of film containing images from one section of Djulfa that he planned to retrieve later. He was not allowed back. After the Soviet collapse, things got even worse. Any photograph of Djulfa, like this one, had to be taken from the Iranian side of the border. Steven Sim, who visited Nakhichevan in August 2005, was the last known outsider to see Djulfa on situ. But at least it was still there, for now. I first learned of the destruction of Djulfa as it was happening when I was 19. In December 2005, northern Iran's Armenian prelate, Bishop Nishan Topuzyan, had shared a chilling video. Over 100 uniformed young men in Azerbaijan, my age, armed with sledgehammers, cranes, and dump trucks, were systematically smashing Djulfa's khachkars. As another undergraduate student, Sarah Pickman and I first reported the year after the erasure, including through a film we co-created, this was not a one-time outburst. Djulfa's erasure, as Pickman and I showed in comprehensive detail in Hyperallergic in 2019, was the finale of a years-long campaign from 1997 to 2006 that erased every single monument across Nakhichevan that Azerbaijan assessed as Armenian. An estimated 89 churches and chapels, 5,840 khachkars, and over 22,000 tombstones gone without a trace. No other place on earth has experienced cultural destruction of the scale. Today, however, 20 years later, I want to explain why what happened at Djulfa was as extraordinary as it was ordinary. Extraordinary, of course, for its scale and for the brazenness of its denial, which prompted the American Association for the Advancement of Science's pioneering satellite investigation into heritage crime conducted in collaboration with me. And ordinary in its surface logic, a logic that recurs often unnoticed across conflicts, societies, and even intimate relationships. A logic I have investigated through this question: why do some states destroy an adversary's cultural heritage while others do not? My answer begins with a concept I call disquieting heritage. This refers to material memories, sacred sites, monuments, artifacts whose very existence provokes anxiety. Disquieting heritage unsettles societies and states by challenging preferred narratives of identity and legitimacy. Why does this matter? Because everywhere, personally and politically, we share a universal impulse, the deep need to be right. To be right, not only in the present, but in the story we tell about the past. Under stress and dealing with distressing material memories, this need intensifies. We begin to wish not merely for victory, but for the absence, and sometimes the past perfect absence of anything that disquiets. Seneca wrote that humans are tormented by things past or things to come, that is, by memory of pain and anticipatory anxiety. In personal conflicts, we burn photographs or delete albums. Across group conflicts, especially when dealing with authoritarian and ontological or existential contexts, the wish to eliminate anxiety, past and future alike, becomes more fanatical. This is where the new phrase that I propose, past proofing the future, comes in. I introduced this term to describe and predict the attempt by states, communities, and even individuals to create a future in which disquieting memories never existed in the first place. It is not just rewriting history. It is attempting to erase the conditions under which alternative histories could even be imagined. Past proofing can be a fantasy, a way to deal with stress. It can also be violent. In 2021, 2 years after the hyperallergic expose, I published a forensic follow-up in the Art newspaper documenting 8 destroyed Armenian churches in the medieval town of Agulis, based on declassified Cold War satellite imagery in collaboration with Caucasus Heritage Watch. Azerbaijan's ambassador replied, as evidence later that year at the International Court of Justice, with denial that inadvertently also served as a confirmation. Quote, first and foremost, we need to make it clear that there is no such thing as Armenian heritage in the Nakhichevan Autonomous Republic simply because Armenians never lived there. Non-existing sites or cemeteries cannot be destroyed. Unquote. The evidence did not matter. The past had to conform, to borrow from Laura Jane Smith, to the authorized discourse of the present and the future, not the other way around. At first, such posturing may indicate a projection of pain. Indeed, after the Soviet collapse, Azerbaijan lost the First Nagorno-Karabakh War, establishing a trauma-based national identity. But even after winning a rematch in 2020 and ethnically cleansing the captured region in 2023, past proofing the future never stopped. A BBC interview with President Ilham Aliyev in November 2020, a month after he vowed that, quote, there will be no trace of Armenians left on those lands, unquote, captured this logic. Asked about the previous month's dual airstrikes on the Ghazanchetsot Cathedral, 2 hits minutes apart, he suggested Armenians shelled the sacred cathedral themselves. Asked about cluster munitions, he claimed Armenians used them, not Azerbaijan. So everything is fake news? The BBC reporter asked. Of course, he replied. Why not? If the present can be so easily reinvented, the past stands little chance. Clive Foss has noted that autocrats find it irresistibly easy to invent the past. After all, there is no one to stop them. Among past-obsessed authoritarian leaders, Atatürk, who founded modern Turkey on the ashes of the Armenian genocide, once said, quote, writing history is as important as making history, unquote. Important for whom? Sure, past proofing responds to a societal anxiety over unresolved, disquieting heritage. But above all, past proofing, even especially violently, is an authoritarian fast track to prolonged rule, offering legitimation and longevity in ways that no other recipe does, as noted in different works by other scholars. Eric Hobsbawm observed that real or imagined history is raw material from which nationalist ideologies derive their legitimation. But nationalism is not self-contained. It is a vehicle that mobilizes and magnifies disquieting heritage. And most importantly, this instinct to seal the future by reshaping the past is not simply nationalism or authoritarianism. It is everywhere. Even sensible scholars can fall into this logic. In a 1995 volume on nationalism and archaeology, Philip Cole and Gochat Zatkladze write that, quote, the historical archaeology of southern Georgia clearly supports a legitimate Georgian claim, unquote, to the region, an arresting sentence in a chapter otherwise critical of using real or imagined antiquity for political legitimation. Yet the context matters. Georgia had just watched Armenians win a war next door, and fears of secession appeared to Gochat all too real. That even leading experts can pass proof the future means that the impulse is universal. It is among all of us. Yet the erasure at Djulfa and all of Nakhichevan's Armenian past exposes the authoritarian logic by which ulterior calculations turn that impulse into a state crime. On December 15, 2005, the Russian agency Regnum broke the news over Djulfa. Its title reading, Cultural Genocide of Armenian Monuments, continues in Nakhichevan. At the time, the title may have seemed exaggerated, given the little we knew about the rest of the terrain. 14 years later, The Guardian, quoting me, reaffirmed this was, in fact, the worst cultural genocide of the 21st century, at least thus far. Yet, despite the magnitude of the loss and the context of conflict, the 1997 to 2006 erasure of all material Armenian memories in Nakhichevan was not about populism. As Ulvi Ismail and I expose in a forthcoming publication, there was no popular support of the destruction for various reasons, including a local belief in superstition. Instead, the erasure followed a logic I have elsewhere termed regime rationality, not delusion as genocidal violence is often explained, but a strategic pursuit of authoritarian legitimation through performance, one of accomplishing and of getting away with what the regime imagines, to quote Dirk Moses, as permanent security. Put simply, Nakhichevan's Armenian heritage was constructed as an existential or ontological threat, in other words, securitized, and the Aliyev regime proved its worth by resolving that threat forever. heritage securitization is common across ethnoterritorial conflicts, but it almost never escalates to total erasure. What makes the difference is the legitimacy deficit built into autocracies. Violence on the scale not only delivers an imagined permanent security, it also showcases the regime's ability to act without consequence. In this sense, as I will argue elsewhere, the destruction in Nakhichevan also functioned as a pre-enactment of the bloodier violence that would follow, namely the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh. That cultural heritage has been a victim of violence across conflicts is nothing new. It has been an evident tool of submission, plunder, and power projection through the centuries. A 2,700-year-old relic, for instance, proudly details the Assyrian attack on a major temple in Musasir, boasting of inflicting transgenerational trauma on the enemy. Quote, I caused cries of mourning to be uttered throughout the entire land Urartu, and established wailing in the land Nairi for all future time. Unquote. More recently, in the first quarter of the 21st century, whether perpetrated by ISIS against Assyrians and the Yazidis, or by China against the Uyghurs or Uyghurs of Xinjiang, such criminality, like the erasure in Nakhichevan, is a projection and prolongation of power, whether rationalized as sanctity or security. This is not to say that vandalism always pursues political power. Often, various groups, including former victims, engage in destruction. That the erasure in Nakhichevan is unprecedented and unmatched is not an excuse to overlook Armenian violations, however disproportionate. Caucasus Heritage Watch documented in 2023, using satellite imagery, that nearly 15% of Islamic monuments under Armenian control in Nagorno-Karabakh were destroyed, and many more neglected after the 1990s Armenian-Azerbaijani War. Concurrently, as Andras Vrilmeyer's forensic fieldwork on post-Yugoslav heritage crime reminds us, the fact that no side in a conflict is angelic does not mean that systematic erasure should be equivocated with vandalism. Neither does it mean that fantasies of past proofing the future are authoritarian choices alone. In fact, I observe three ways in which the future is past proofed across all conflicts. First, like in Nakhichevan, authoritarian states motivated by regime rationality and performance legitimacy resolve disquieting heritage through negation, that is, violent physical destruction. Second, sometimes heritage is not systematically bulldozed, but left to decay or be looted. This is not negation, but neglect, similar to the fate of many Armenian heritage sites across Turkey. Third is negotiation, which reconciles disquieting material memories with non-destructive options. This path is the hardest, and could lead to reconciliation by acknowledging both trauma and truth. These three general choices, negate, neglect, or negotiate, and their variations are always an option. Sometimes societies and states, even authoritarian ones, use a mixed approach. But most importantly, across all scenarios, even in the worst of scenarios, victims are not without agency. Despite the negation of Djulfa, for instance, Armenian communities have shown remarkable agency by replicating hundreds of khachkars that now stand across Armenia and the world. And pictured here is one of the craftsmen, Varpet Varo, Varazdat Hambartumian, who has replicated hundreds of them himself in his Yerevan studio. Agency is embedded in the connection to sacred sites, in the fear of a dual abandonment and loss when that connection is interrupted. One that should make us rethink stakeholder rights as stakeholder responsibilities. Armenian pilgrims, for instance, have helped preserve endangered sites in Turkey by creating local incentives for protection and knowingly or unknowingly engaged in de-securitization. Showing by showing up that adoration for one's sacred sites is no threat to national security. If similar pilgrimages were allowed in Nagorno-Karabakh, we could see a better outcome than what happened in Nakhichevan. Of course, Azerbaijan is preparing ground for quite the opposite, proclaiming all of Armenia, as we see in news reports on almost everyday basis, as Western Azerbaijan. This is, to a point, predictable when an authoritarian's legitimacy is singularly tied to defeating a demonized enemy. Conflict is the only recipe for regime survival. But that is no reason to give up. And here is a counterintuitive argument as to why. Despite the overpowering impulse to negate disquieting memories, there is no such thing as truly past-proofing the future, especially through erasure, least of all through violence. Because memory lives on in different ways, and factors that enable erasure are not static. Even on a personal level, when we burn a photograph or delete an album, we don't truly resolve the disquieting past. We create instead a new memory, one of erasure, which can live on more forcefully than what we had meant to forget. There is no such thing as truly past-proofing the future, especially through erasure, because societies change and voices like that of Azerbaijan's erstwhile national author Akram Aylisli join the resistance. Because narratives shift and the truth ultimately prevails. Because children inherit stories and become the storytellers. Argam Ayvazyan, who documented the material memories of Nakhichevan, was a teenager, like I was, like Sarah Pickman was, when he embarked on his monumental journey to document a historical terrain that he thought was bound to disappear. And it did. Of course, this is an emotional devastation that we may never fully recover from. After all, unlike Ayvazyan and the lucky few, including my father, the rest of us will never see Djulfa. But we, the stakeholders, have agency, especially when it comes to violent past proofing. An agency, not one of simply rights, but of responsibilities. We can rebuild meaning for our children and for all children, hoping that their generation's impulse in resolving disquieting heritage, that is, to past-proof the future, will not be to negate or neglect, but to negotiate, to desecuritize sacred sites, to confront difficult histories with truth and justice and the possibility of long-term peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating talk, Simon. That was just amazing. We are now going to turn the event over to Professor Peter Cowe for his commentary and discussion. So, Peter, if you could unmute yourself and show yourself, we'll look forward to your comments.
Good evening. Those concerned with issues of cultural maintenance and the phenomenon of cultural erasure have gained much insight from Dr. Maghakyan's ongoing research in those areas of great contemporary importance for the appreciation and study of the Armenian heritage in different parts of the world. Today, we particularly value the opportunity his presentation has afforded us to extend a backward glance at the catastrophic destruction of the khachkars in the Armenian cemetery of Old Djulfa on the Artsakh some 2 decades ago. I'm sure the memory is still raw for many of us, our initial reaction evolving from one of incredulity that such an action was possible to the visceral response of loss, then revulsion at the depths of depravity our species is capable of, and finally disquietude at the fragility of what we call civilization, or at least normalcy. Thereafter, some will have fallen into apathy, while others were galvanized to pursue various remedies, legal, political, or creative, reanimating the structures in other media and counteracting the erasure with renewed resolve. However, all of these are immediate responses focused on the action and the tangible results. Little attention was given to understanding what seemed incomprehensible: the obliteration of the place of eternal rest of thousands of souls in a quiet, uninhabited landscape of no apparent strategic or geopolitical significance. Most of all, the incident appeared completely random, a strike out of the blue without warning. Hence the timeliness of Dr. Maghakyan's argument that it is the result of a much longer process of gestation, planning, and execution of a strategy eminently patient of analysis and understanding of the predominant factors behind it. In contrast to the pattern of invasion he highlighted from Assyrian history, intent on imposing hegemony, Typologically modern examples feature ideological concerns, dividing groups into insider and outsider categories. The Djulfa case reflects constructed narratives of history and contemporary identity in one space, contested by two or more polities. But we might also consider the partisan debate in the transition from one ideology to another in one society. While in both cases, the intensity of the intervention, in Maghakyan's terminology, negation and neglect, depends on the perceived urgency of the threat and is calibrated by the presence or relative absence of external restraint, leading in extreme situations like the Djulfa to the application of absolute force, granted the absolute significance the target bears in a given value system. Moreover, the actors involved may be engaged at both the state, regional, and local levels. Applying this framework more concretely to the Djulfa case and the contestation that provoked it, and slightly elongating Maghakyan's timeframe, we observe the relatively recent construction of the Azerbaijani Soviet Republic, a little more than a century ago, which assumed the initiative of the Soviet nationalities policy for the major demographic of the constituent republics to draw up their own history. This then led to the artificial conflation with Albanian Christianity as lineal successors that adopted Islam, hence permitting an indigenous genealogy, both promulgated and denounced, purely in the written medium from the 1960s onwards, since the central authorities would not have sanctioned escalation to a further level. The latter was activated in the ethnic cleansing of the major part of the Republic, for example, through the Sumgayit pogrom of 1988, characteristic of the process of transition. Clearly, as Maghakyan signals, the First Karabakh War revealed to Azerbaijan the other side's serious intention to reclaim and hold the territory, revamping its original name of Artsakh as the independent republic's official designation. I would argue that in the Djulfa spectrum, we can't ignore the factor of Armenian occupation of various purely Azerbaijani territories and weariness regarding the prolonged period of inconclusive discussions from 1994 on, settling the war and signing a final treaty. Additionally, as Maghakyan notes, obliterating the khachkars in 2005 marks the culmination of a systematic, relatively clandestine process of destroying the Armenian cultural heritage over the rest of Nakhichevan. As Arman Hakhnazaryan recalled, some years previously, he had proposed to the Scottish architect Stephen Sim, already alluded by Maghakyan, the creator of the website Virtual Ani, to undertake an inventory of the various Armenian sites there. On day 3 of his visit, the gendarmerie presented him with the ultimatum to leave the enclave that day. Of the sites he had checked until that point, none was still standing. The impact of an unpopular dictatorship wishing to maintain power by diverting public opinion against an external foe will also have been a factor, as well as perhaps the deterrent element of destroying the area's material culture as a disincentive to repossessing a landscape hereafter devoid of ethnic cultural markers and diminishing potential international support for such a move. Maghakyan's comparison with relations with Turkey is very apposite in this regard. The apparent dynamiting of the Khachkar monastic complex seems consonant with the tensions of the 1950s, while the later policy of neglect, leaving Armenian sites to the ravages of the climate, reflects the perception that the primary issue of genocide recognition relates to territory mainly in the context of potential reparations, supported by the denial by successive Armenian administrations of pursuing territorial claims with Turkey. Interfacing with the official policy, but independent in its outworking, is the factor of local agency embracing the entrepreneur's investment in Armenian edifices as barns, garages, etc., and instances like the Kurdish community employing the St. John the Baptist Monastery in Mush as its domicile. Meanwhile, developing Maghakyan's third possible approach of negotiation, I'd like to note that granted the more pragmatic perspective on the local level, instances like the synergy between Armenian tourists/pilgrims at the monastery of Varak, south of Lake Van, with the Hoja of the local mosque, have produced useful results in maintaining the purity of the holy site in a way that all sides can appreciate. Certainly, there is much room for impressing on local tourism officials the financial value of maintaining Armenian cultural sites like their Greek counterparts, for example, Pergamum or the Sumila monastery at Trabzon. In concluding, I'd like to underscore the practical significance of Maghakyan's emphasis on the desirability of Armenian stakeholder rights morphing into stakeholder responsibilities. The logic of his trajectory for territorial contestation and identity construction in Nakhichevan leads to the inexorable conclusion that it is but a prefiguration of the likely result of cultural destruction already underway in Nagorno-Karabakh. Hence, there is no justification to view the latter as unlikely or unreasonable. This heralds the desirability of advocacy and activism at all levels, in a display of concerned, committed engagement, rather than waiting for the total loss to trigger an emotional outpouring, as in the case of Djulfa. Rather, the need is to channel that emotion into accelerating the task of documenting and digitizing cultural memory there, as well as in the Artsakh community in exile in the Armenian Republic and elsewhere. Raising consciousness about the issue and striving to mobilize political and legal restraints to counteract the event before its perpetration, in an awareness that intervention matters and can change outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Peter Cowe, Dr. Simon Maghakyan, for some very stimulating commentary, the presentation, Dr. Maghakyan. We now can open up the webinar to questions from our audience. I can maybe start and then we can address some of the questions that are beginning to appear in our Q&A. Simon, thank you so much for this really thoughtful presentation. I have a couple of questions as a non-specialist in this area. You know, it's so frustrating to hear that, you know, pilgrims cannot access, tourists can access these sites in Nakhichevan and certainly not in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh at the moment. Do designations of such cultural heritage sites by UNESCO, for example, or other international bodies, does that make any difference? Does that have any teeth with respect to a country's obligation to protect such sites?
Thank you, Professor Karagosian, for that question. So UNESCO in particular, the World Heritage Site designations are proposed by the state members themselves on their own territory. So the designation or the first step in the nomination already projects an interest in preservation. So that in itself would be a good thing. The question then we would need to discuss, would Armenia protest the revisionist narrative presented to UNESCO, let's say, if Gandzasar is presented as a UNESCO site, or would it, for the sake of preservation, physical preservation, go ahead, assuming Azerbaijan would present it in the first place? It's not a great choice. But if Azerbaijan were to nominate, for me at the moment, the physical preservation would obviously be number one. But again, all of these are um, volunteer and sovereign choices by states, and state narrative shift, priority shift. We see how Turkey, and I wish we had Professor Christina Maranzi here, who's been going to Ani and describing how the UNESCO site there has been going different transformation, and most recently what she called Seljukification. So even if Turkey is presenting it and protecting it with all the vandalism that it has done, that Steven Sim has documented in that preservation process, that even after a nomination, that there's still narratives that go try to diminish the actual history of the site, or try to present a time capsule of a preferred sort of Turkic memory when it was captured and dominated, etc. So in short, it could help, but to be honest, I don't see Azerbaijan making those nominations. If they did, and even if they lied about the history of the sites in the nominations, I think that would be something promising, because that would give hope for physical preservation. But I'm not that hopeful, to be honest.
Thank you. Okay, we have several questions from our audience, and please, those of you in our Zoom audience, if you have questions, feel free to click on the Q&A button and type in your question. Here is another question, primarily, I think, for you, Simon. In a computer animation era where so much is capable, 3D renderings and so forth, how plausible is it through historical photographs and sketches to recreate virtually the medieval Armenian cemetery and indeed other cultural heritage sites?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I mean, there is a whole field, and I'll answer technically and then maybe go into sort of the ethics of that. There's a whole field called, I think, digital humanities, and some pilot projects that have taken place, including one that was tentatively called digital repatriation. And this was done by an Australian group about a decade ago, and I was one of the consultants, where they were trying to recreate through different technologies based on Ayvazyan's and others' photographs, the Djulfa cemetery, and it was awfully expensive. And of course, it's better to have that documentation. We saw Tumo 3D scan churches in Artsakh, and even in bordering Armenian areas in recent years. So that documentation is, of course, extremely important, and better to have that than have no record at all. Um, but for me, the ethics of that, or sort of the idea of seeing that as replacement, um, I mean, that's an interesting conversation. And I think at the last conference we talked about this, sort of whether that can be thought of as an extra statal dignity restoration, when communities sort of try to recreate whatever they can on their own, and that's an interesting discussion. And we have seen, as I mentioned very briefly, recreation of khachkars by hand based on photographs, etc. So some of that does happen. I mean, there is that interest in Djulfa khachkars that did not exist before the destruction. So those are, to me, those are philosophical questions that open up good conversations. But the more practical question is sort of, how can the ongoing destruction, although it seems to have slowed to a degree in Artsakh, be prevented by raising the cost of destruction on the Aliyev government, etc. If Professor Cowe maybe has further thoughts on this idea of digital repatriation, he might have something more interesting to say. So I'd like to hear from him as well, if that's okay.
Peter, would you like to offer any comments
There we go.
on the subject of digitization?
Yes, absolutely. So I too was a consultant on that project, and I agree that it was exorbitant. But I think that it is extremely important as time goes on. This is very valuable, I think, as a means both then of maintaining cultural memory, but perhaps even more so as a vehicle for further research. And I think that some much more inexpensive variations have been experimented with in different parts of the world. I'm familiar with some that have been done with regard to some of the Armenian monuments around Salmast in northern Iran. And that different sorts of focuses provide different perspectives on the site, and I think that they raise very interesting ideas. I'm also familiar with another project that not only then focuses on this is regard to a totally different culture, but a temple complex where the importance of acoustics was crucial, and the attempt to try to include in that three-dimensional reconstruction also something of an acoustic element to that. So I think that we are increasingly becoming a virtual culture, and I think it's very important, even apart from this discussion, obviously, of cultural erasure, that the significance of these sorts of projects becomes more and more significant and important, that I think in Armenian studies too, we take them much more seriously and become much more directly involved in them, because I think quite apart from the issues, I say, of facing destruction of the originals, they have great value in different areas of research.
Thank you. Another question actually follows up on something you mentioned, Simon, regarding the cemetery in Djulfa with the khachkars. One viewer asks, was not that cemetery recognized by UNESCO? And if so, did UNESCO respond in any way to the destruction of the khachkars? Are you familiar with that?
Yes, so that's a good question. So what happened? So the answer is no. On the first one, no designation, and the response, nothing directly. Although behind the scenes in 1998, there was a successful effort by UNESCO to halt the ongoing destruction. So it's not that they haven't done anything, but they certainly haven't condemned it after the fact. It was not nominated. Again, Azerbaijan would have to nominate it. It was not. However, the Armenian government did something smart or diplomatic, and after the destruction, they nominated the art and tradition of khachkar making as an intangible heritage of humanity. So it was not the physical monuments, but the art of khachkar making was made into a UNESCO intangible art tradition. So we could argue that ex post facto, so posthumously, the khachkars were protected under that UNESCO intangible heritage, but it's not the same as a UNESCO World Heritage, the physical site designation.
Okay, thank you. You know, what you described with respect to the documentation thus far of what's been happening in Artsakh, the overhead imagery that is made use of by Cultural Heritage, Caucasus Heritage Watch, that organization in particular, this is something that did not exist very widely, 20 plus years ago. These kinds of technologies can be used, disseminated very widely. So this is the time in which that kind of project can be invested in, perhaps not necessarily by the US government or governments, but by individuals as well. Can you talk about what that organization is doing, in particular with respect to Artsakh, but also what they have documented in the past that will be particularly relevant to publicize widely, certainly to publish in scholarly journals, I would imagine.
Yes, thank you for bringing this up, and I hope the viewers are familiar with Caucasus Heritage Watch, based primarily at Cornell University, that has been monitoring over 500 sites in Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh under Azerbaijan's newfound control. And it's an organization that has to manually look through, hundreds of sites 4 times a year, and they invest the time into that, but they do need support for acquiring satellite materials, which are very expensive. And since I've worked with them, but also done satellite investigations on my own, including 20 years ago when I purchased a satellite image for $300, the largest purchase of my life at the time, when I was an undergraduate student. That is expensive. I mean, to this day, it's really expensive, and they have an ongoing campaign, which I know some of us on this call have already supported, but it would be great if others joined. They're happy to take anything from $5 to whatever people can afford. It's also important to show our support for this project. And I'll mention how important participation from the public is, because recently the U.S. government stopped the satellite monitoring of Ukrainian heritage sites, and so that program stopped. There was satellite monitoring of sites by ISIS a decade ago, and that was heavily supported by the U.S. government, so which is why it happened. But prior to that, the only cultural investigation that came out, which I reference from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, I had to really push for it at the time. I worked at Amnesty International, and right now, Caucasus Heritage Watch, as far as I know, they don't have any large support for their work, so they're relying on small grants and here and there. And so it's important to invest in what they're doing, because that truly raises the cost on Azerbaijan when it comes to destruction. And I mean, I don't know if there can be conclusive evidence of how impactful Caucasus Heritage Watch's research has been, but certainly there has been a slowing down of destruction, as far as I can tell from the most recent available reports. So they're doing monumental work, and they should be supported, of course.
Thank you. I've just put a link to Caucasus Heritage Watch, that project, which, as you mentioned, is hosted by Cornell University, into the chat, so our viewers can take a look at this project if they are not familiar with it. They do amazing work. And again, it's not inexpensive to be able to access the detailed overhead satellite imagery that is necessary with the repeat times to be able to see over time what is happening on the ground. This technology was not available, like I say, 20 some years ago. Let me see. There are a few other questions and comments here. So one, of course, a number of our viewers thank you for your presentation, as we all do, Simon. One viewer would like to hear about the reception of your research. Have you encountered points of friction or pushback from any organizations or parties? Is there anything illuminating that you would like to share about these moments for those who are interested and invested in preserving and advancing Armenian culture? Any anecdotes you'd like to share, or generalities, if you wish?
Um, well, I mean, I'm not going to personalize it, and I'll speak more generally. Mention Arkam Ayvazyan, myself, Sarah Pickman, Steven Sim, all these people who have done the work that they are doing. Most of us have not done this as part of institutions. Most of us have not had funding. And so it has come at horrendous personal sacrifices, both financial and otherwise. There are some risks that some have been publicized, others have not. Um, and but there's also a huge plus to being independent, being unfunded. You can do things without having to follow sort of grant guidelines, etc. So anyone and every institution that's independent, has their pros and cons. In terms of um, pushback, scholarly pushback, I have not. I collaborate with sensible Azerbaijani scholars. There's only a handful. One of them is in prison, and I just learned today that he was taken to an even more isolated area. I'm talking about Baru Samadov. I already mentioned Ulvi Ismail. I'm co-authoring a chapter with him, and so forth. And so, I mean, none of this is controversial or sort of outside of any sort of mainstream or even critical scholarship areas. You have, and to be honest, the Azerbaijani government makes the work really easy by with their denial, and it's a very obvious. So there's no scholarly debate. Of course, we may have scholars who prefer different theoretical explanations and all of that, but there is no um, scholarly debate. I mean, there is a lot of intimidation, not just of Armenian or Azerbaijan researchers. There's also intimidation of researchers of the Uyghur or Uyghur heritage in China. I know of scholars who do research and they don't publish because they're afraid. Um, when I was doing my own PhD, one of the pieces of advice that I received was it would be harder for me to get a job if that I'm using a Chinese example in addition to Azerbaijan. And of course, being the person I am, I did not take the advice, but there are repercussions for this work, and the most hurtful ones are the probably the trolling by Armenians on social media, because you expect people who are stakeholders in this to value this more, but you know uh, that's just how the world is. That we have some community members who don't appreciate those who dedicate their lives and risk their livelihoods and more for this work, but that's part of the game.
Yes, I don't think that's unique to Armenians, but it's certainly something that one can observe. Let me also mention, of course, that in the Republic of Armenia, within the National Academy of Sciences or the Cultural Heritage Institute, Dr. Hamlet Petrosyan, Dr. Nujde Yaranian, they have published a volume recently pertaining to the monument culture in Artsakh, and it's wonderful documentation of the cultural heritage from that perspective in Artsakh. So at the very least, this kind of scholarly documentation is available, but preserving, as you say, the real thing is so much more important. Um, would you like to, a few of our questions pertain to efforts by the Armenian government in terms of engagement with preservation. Would you care to comment on any of that, or historically what at the time, relatively newly established Republic of Armenia did with respect to Nakhichevan and protection or what is happening now. I don't know if you'd like to make any comments. You're welcome to.
Oh, that's a really tough conversation because in hindsight we can say so many things that should have been done and could have been done. And I don't want to throw both the current and the past Armenian governments under the bus for, all the missed opportunities. But I do want to make this point, and that's even though it's a historical point for the future, it's important to recognize, and this is my personal conviction, that the destruction in Nakhichevan could have been avoided had Armenians, when they had won the war right after 1994, had found some sort of a solution, even though it would not have been a perfect solution, and there would never be a perfect solution to a conflict like this. And I'm hoping that as a community, as a nation, we won't let, the perfect become the enemy of the good. And because the losses like the erasure in Nakhichevan, that they're truly irreversible, and so everything should have been done to prevent that, and it wasn't.
Yeah. Thank you. Very sobering words, but we can learn from the past. We don't have to repeat it. I don't know, Professor Peter Cowe, do you have any final remarks that you would like to offer? You're still here.
Yes, thank you, Anne. Yes, with regard to the situation in Nakhichevan, I'm in complete agreement. In fact, my in-laws on the maternal side are from there, and I have an interesting comment with regard to the previous generation. So they obviously left at the time after the genocide in the late 10s, early 1920s. But back in the early 1960s, they paid a visit, and they went to see their original home and to get a sense then of what the atmosphere was at that time. And already it was very, very clear that apart from the immediate group of those that were directly associated with the family and remembered that link, that there was a great deal of enmity that they experienced, and there never was any further attempt on the part of the family to try to reiterate that. So I think that the situation there probably didn't have all that many real options for any attempt at coming to some sort of negotiation. I hope that the situation may change in Azerbaijan as a whole. As Stephen was saying, obviously there is continually the prospect of change, and clearly I don't think that we can necessarily expect that the continuing rule there will continue within that one particular family. One of the things which I think is very striking is that we receive, on the whole, very little information about exactly how much dissidence there is in that republic. But I think from what we hear, there is more than perhaps we originally imagined. And I think that, as Stephen was suggesting, these sorts of outreaches to try to build bridges where they may be formed at this point, and with the hope that perhaps this might be further extended, this, I think, sounds extremely plausible. I also wanted to mention that I think not everyone was silent or inactive during this extremely important period when this area of Nagorno-Karabakh was under Armenian administration. So you both of you mentioned other initiatives in that direction. I'd just like to add one more with regard to the organization Research on Armenian Architecture, connected then with Armen Haghdassarian, who founded it. And so his successors have been very, very much involved in the documentation of Armenian material culture outside the Armenian Republic, and have at this point then amassed quite an important dossier on all of those centers in Karabakh. And I think that perhaps going forward, one of the major issues which is required is precisely for a more systematic portal to be arranged, more systematic collaboration between these different organizations to pool resources and to create a fuller presentation of precisely that cultural heritage in all of its richness and diversity.
Thank you. I think we actually have several additional questions. If you have a few more minutes, Simon.
Yes.
They pertain actually to very similar topics to the sort of story, the narrative that Azerbaijan is promulgating with respect to its own facts on the ground in terms of what cultural heritage sites actually are, not Armenian, Caucasian Albanian, or the way that they are trying to kind of manipulate UNESCO. For example, they have recently obtained a seat on the UNESCO World Heritage Committee. They are starting to talk about so-called Western Azerbaijan and talking about these historic Armenian lands. Have you noticed, as a scholar, a transition in the language that is being used and the actions that are being taken by Azerbaijan, either before the attack and takeover of Nagorno-Karabakh or afterwards? And would you like to comment on any of that?
Yes, thank you for combining several of the questions. I think when we look at the timeline of the destruction of Djulfa and all of Nakhichevan's heritage, there are some patterns that emerge, and there are some dates. First of all, Azerbaijan is very big on dates and anniversaries, even specific dates, etc. To the point that it's mind-boggling that someone actually takes the time to try to make those connections and have some certain events be repeated on particular anniversaries. But something that happened in 2007 has caught my eye, and I'm still investigating this to a degree. But it seems like that was a pivotal year in Azerbaijan's narrative production, and in part because the Aliyev father and son replacement happened several years earlier, and the son was trying to prove that he was better than the father, I think, as much as he could. And of course, he had the chance to prove himself better on the battlefield in 2020. But before that, this performative victories that he was trying to deliver through use of historical material. And it's of no surprise, and this will be a surprise to probably almost everyone here. Ilham Aliyev has a PhD in history. So he's a doctor of history. Of course, who knows, how he got first to the university when his father was already a prominent Soviet leader, and how he actually managed to finish it. That's a different story. I don't know anything of that, but he has this obsession with history. And I believe, and I need to do more archival research, but I believe once the destruction happened or was finalized in Nakhichevan, and the deadline from one specific decree that I'll be writing more about later on was given as the end of 2006. So before 2007, everything had to be done, cleared out in Nakhichevan, in not just destroying what was obvious. They created a whole committee to go ahead and do archaeological surveys. So basically, literally leave no stone unturned across Nakhichevan to make sure that there was no Christian iconography or Armenian lettering on it. And in 2007, if my memory serves correctly, they published this book, The Heritage of Western Azerbaijan, which is all about Armenia. So at the same time of destroying everything Armenian in Nakhichevan, then they also start this narrative. And I think Dr. Aliyev came up with this, was to basically have the mirror story. Armenians refer to historical Armenia, which is primarily in Turkey, as Western Armenia. Those of you who might be fans of that movie Borat, the comedy where he says, if I have a radio, my neighbor must have a radio. So sort of that line of thinking, which is kind of it's ridiculous, it's funny, except when it becomes violent, right? And so I think it was year 2007, which was this idea that we're just going to do everything that Armenia does, and in their mind, it's all organized by the state, and it's not, right? Um, and interestingly enough, after the war, and especially after this peace deals that Armenia is forced to undergo with Azerbaijan, that they're doubling down on all of this propaganda, and not just in for internal consumption. I mean, there are so many examples that have gone unnoticed. In Colorado, for example, just last year, they opened a diaspora office. Um, and the first thing it did was to organize a commemoration of Azerbaijani suffering in the first Nagorno-Karabakh war. And we see the daily reports in Azerbaijan, etc. I mean, some might say if they want to put sort of a very benevolent perspective on this, that Azerbaijan is doing everything to preempt sort of Armenian demands for the return of Armenians to Artsakh, to their homes. But it seems it's gone above and beyond that, and this did not just happen after the war. This had been in the making for years and years, and I think we will see more of that. Um, and I don't know what the right response, because that's the next question. Well, what do we do about that? My answer is always, we don't, fight darkness with darkness. We need more light, more illumination. And so one of the things that I think my research aims to accomplish is not to demonize the Aliyev regime, although it's an interesting caricature that that has been made into a caricature in that movie Borat itself. Again, fans of the movie may remember the very last slide actually shows Ilham Aliyev, even though he had just become president just a few years earlier. But it's important to understand the enabling factors that allow for these processes to take place, and how that can be resisted. And the Aliyev regime knows that the ones who are most effective are sensible Azerbaijani scholars who collaborate. And by collaboration, I don't necessarily mean always writing a paper, who even interact with, researchers like me, have cordial and sometimes challenging conversations about different things of the past. And now they are trying to create a state-managed sort of dialogue where they have handpicked civil society members, or historians or whatnot, who have actually actively participated in the ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh, to come into Armenia to pretend to lead those conversations. And I don't think it's going to lead anywhere good. But that's no reason for the conversations with sensible Azerbaijani scholars, even if they're a handful, to stop, because that's what's ultimately going to take to overcome this conflict, is by telling the truth about this, and by looking at real solutions for the future.
Absolutely. And by making that scholarly work known, rigorous scholarly work, so that journalists, if they know nothing about the subject, can go and see this kind of the truth that is documented. So thank you again so much, Simon, for just a fascinating presentation, and for your very diligent documentation of what has happened in Nakhichevan, what could potentially be happening in Artsakh, and we wish you all the best in your future endeavors. Thank you as well to Professor Peter Cowe for your very insightful comments as well. We'll now bring our event to a close. Let me note that this is our last Promise Armenian Institute event of 2025, but we have many more events that are in the works for the new year. So we encourage our audience to check our website and social media pages to learn more about these events, as well as other opportunities for engagement with our Promise Armenian Institute community here at UCLA. Before closing, I'd like to offer my grateful thanks to our Promise Armenian Institute Deputy Director, Ms. Hasmik Bagdasarian, as well as Ms. Naden Hartunian, who is working as well on this webinar. We thank you for your great efficiency, as always, in coordination. Thank you once again to our audience for your attendance, and we look forward to welcoming you to future events of the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA. Have a wonderful holiday season and a wonderful new year to all of you. Thank you.